So chapter 28, of course, Paul, in the last chapter, they started the long travel from Caesarea to Rome, and of course we've seen the troubles that they've run into thus far. And as we talked briefly about last week, those troubles were not over. Obviously, as chapter 27 ends, they've shipwrecked into this island, and that's kind of where we pick it up this morning in chapter 28, verse 1. It says, "And when they were escaped, then they knew that the island was called Melita, and the barbarous people showed us no little kindness. For they kindled a fire and received us every one because of the present rain and because of the cold. And when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, there came a viper out of the heat and fastened on his hand. And when the barbarians saw the venomous beast hang on his hand, they said among themselves, No doubt this man is a murderer, whom though he hath escaped the sea, yet vengeance suffereth not to live. And he shook off the beast into the fire and felt no harm. Howbeit they looked when he should have swollen or fallen down dead suddenly. But after they looked a great while and saw no harm come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. And in the same quarters were possessions of the chief man of the island, whose name was Publius, who received us and lodged us 3 days courteously. And it came to pass that the father of Publius lay sick of the fever and of a bloody flux, to whom Paul entered in and prayed and laid his hands on him and healed him. And so when he had done this, others also which had diseases in the island came and were healed, and who also honored us with many honors. And when we departed, they laded us with such things as were necessary. And after 3 months, we departed in a ship of Alexandria, which had wintered in the isle, whose sign was Castor and Pollux. And landing at Syracuse, we tarried there 3 days. And from thence we fetched a compass and came to Rhegium. And after one day, the south wind blew, and we came the next day to Puteoli, where we found brethren, and were desired to stay with them 7 days. And so we went toward Rome. And from thence, when the brethren heard of us, they came to meet us as far as Appio, as the Appia Forum, and the 3 taverns, whom when Paul saw, he thanked God and took courage. And when we came to Rome, the centurion delivered the prisoners to a captain of the guard, but Paul was suffered to dwell by himself with the soldier that kept him. And it came to pass after 3 days that Paul called the chief of the Jews together, and when they were come together, he said unto them, Men and brethren, though I have committed nothing against the people or customs of their fathers, yet was I delivered prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans, whom when they had examined me, would have let me go, because there was no cause of death in me. But when the Jews spake against it, I was constrained to appeal unto Caesar, not that I had aught to accuse my nation of. For this cause, therefore, have I called for you, to see you, and to speak with you, because that for the hope of Israel I am bound with this chain. And they said unto him, We neither received letters out of Judea concerning thee, neither of any of the brethren that came showed or spake any harm of thee. But we desire to hear of thee what thou thinkest, for as thou concernest this sect, we know that everywhere it is spoken against. And when they had appointed him a day, there came many to him to his lodging, to whom he expounded and testified the kingdom of God, persuading them concerning Jesus, both out of the law of Moses and out of the prophets, from morning until evening. Which some believed the things which were spoken, and some believed not. And when they agreed not amongst themselves, they departed, after that Paul had spoken one word. And well spake the Holy Ghost by Isaiah the prophet, saying unto our father, saying, Go unto this people, and say, Hearing you shall hear, and shall not understand, and seeing you shall see, and not perceive. For the heart of this people is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes have they closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and should be converted, and should heal them. But be it known therefore unto you, that the salvation of God is sent unto the Gentiles, and that they will hear it. And when they had said these words, the Jews departed, and had great reasoning amongst themselves. And Paul dwelt 2 whole years in his own hired house, and received all that came unto him, preaching the kingdom of God, and teaching those things which concern the Lord Jesus Christ, with all confidence, no man forbidding him. Now, we're not covering the whole chapter this morning. I wanted to look ahead a little bit to show you what I mean by we don't get maybe all the resolution that we might expect. But there's a reason for that. Now, we'll discuss more of that next week. But even here this morning, like I said, I hope you get the sense of this, where the book is headed. And so here we are, weeks and weeks upon weeks of treacherous sea travel, and then eventual shipwreck, as we saw last week, have finally led Paul and the rest of the 276 men upon the boat to the exact place that God had prophesied. Now, that might sound an odd way to say it, that treacherous sea travel and shipwreck is what got them there, but that's what God chose to get them there. And we've seen that. We've talked about all that. Now, they have found themselves on this island, an island, we'll see here in a minute, with harsh conditions. But even in this, God was gracious. God was gracious to Paul. God was gracious to the rest of the men of the boat. And they were now lost. They were shipwrecked, however, only temporarily. only temporarily, because God would provide not only for them, but as we read there just a second ago, even for the natives of the island. And so God was gracious not just to Paul, not just to the men on the boat, but to the ones who lived on the island where they were. Now, the journey was long. The journey was certainly unexpected, but ultimately they got to their destination because of the grace and because of the goodness of God. And so Luke, he shows us some strange turns along the way. But ultimately, the road always leads exactly where God wanted it to go. And it might be unexpected for us, but it was certainly never unexpected for God. And so here again, we pick it up in verse 1. When they were escaped, they knew that the island was called Midlothian. Now, after their ship was torn apart, we looked at this in the last chapter, they make it to the land. They finally find out where they were. They didn't know this upon their approach. Now, the island of Midlothian, now it's called Malta. That's the name of it now. But the island of Malta was then and is now a well-known place, but the way that they entered the island would not have been known to any of the sailors. But, upon getting to the island and kind of looking around and seeing their surroundings, now they finally understand. They're sailors. They've experienced these waters, and so they kind of understand where they are. Now, just to give you a little bit of idea as to how far they have traveled during this the storm, the island of Midlothian, again, it's now named Malta, but that's what it was called then, is 60 miles south of Sicily. If you understand where Sicily is, just on the southern side of Italy, but 600 miles west of Crete. Now, Crete's where they took off from. And so for 600 miles, they have been blown by these winds, by this terrible storm, finally making their way all the way over here to the island of Malta. Now, the island itself is a very small island. If I remember correctly, I think it's only about 10 miles wide, 17 miles long. I might have those numbers reversed, but it's a small island. And like I said, the sailors didn't recognize it upon their approach because there is a port there, but they obviously did not enter through the port. They entered by means of shipwreck. And so once they get there, there was what the Bible calls here in verse 2, the barbarous people. Now, that word barbarous in the Greek, simply, it is barbarous. It is a barbarian. That's what the word is. But the Greeks used the word barbarian not in the way that we use it today. And so we use the word barbarian, and it carries certain connotations. Somebody who's violent or something along those lines. The Greeks used the word barbarian to simply refer to somebody who wasn't Greek. They didn't speak Greek. They speak, some kind of they would call a crude language or something like that. It was not known to them. It was somebody else kind of. And so the barbarian in the New Testament doesn't carry with it the connotation that we might use today, somebody who's violent or brutal or something like that. And in fact, this text bears that out pretty clearly, because even here, verse 2, the barbarous people showed us no little kindness. And when it says no little kindness, it means they didn't show us a little bit of kindness. They showed us a whole lot of kindness. Okay, that's what that means. And so the term there is used in the Greek context as to how they would have used it. And so the natives are very, very friendly. In fact, so much that as these men shipwrecked and they come up to the island, it says, "For they kindled a fire, and they received us every one," there's an important phrase, "because of the present rain and because of the cold." The storm's still happening. The storm's still going on. The weather's not good. It's cold. And they see all these men, 276 of them, shipwrecked, come to the island. And so what do? The people, they start gathering the wood for a fire. They make a fire to try and warm them and try to get them dry. And again, the key there, verse 2, is that little phrase, every one. Again, that's been the driving force now for a little more than a chapter, is that God promised all made it to the shore. Not only did all make it to the shore, but now all are receiving the kindness of this native people. All are still receiving the grace of God. And all did this because God promised it would be all. They didn't lose a single one. And not only did they not lose a single one, but now every single one of them are continuing to experience the goodness and the grace of God. And so now God had done it kind of miraculously by helping them survive, and now he uses these people, the natives there, as the means or the conduit of God's goodness and grace to all the sailors and soldiers that were upon that particular ship. Now Paul, ever the servant, which is what he was, he refers to himself that way several times in the New Testament. He wants to help, and so even though he's just been part of that shipwreck, he begins to gather sticks and wood to help keep this fire going, and eventually, unknowing so, grabbed this viper grabs this snake. Now, just given the conditions, it's cold. The text has already told us this. That snake would have been fairly lethargic. And so he probably just grabbed a bunch of sticks, not knowing that snake was in there, and it would have been lethargic, and it didn't really begin to gain any activity until it got close to the fire, and that heat, woke him up. And so that snake just started lashing out and bit onto the first thing he sees, which happened to be Paul's hand. Now, they had some superstitions upon that particular group of people. They're pagans, and they have their gods, and so they see this bite, and their first thought was, we've just saw this guy survive the shipwreck. And so we thought, that was a divine sign that they're innocent, that that these are good people, which is maybe even the reason they set the fire for him in the first place. And we talked about this a little bit a couple of weeks ago, that surviving an ordeal at sea was kind of seen as in the pagan context as the gods kind of showing you favor. Well, they've seen this. They understand that they've been shipwrecked. But now, Paul just got bit by this venomous snake. And so now they don't know what to think about this. And so it says that, we saw this guy survive, but now they say, no doubt this man is a murderer, whom though he hath escaped the sea, vengeance suffereth not to live. And so the natives saw this now as some kind of divine makeup. The gods wanted him to die in the shipwreck, but he survived that somehow, and so now they're making up for it. And so now they stuck this snake on him to make sure that he died. And so in their minds, there's no way that Paul is not this murderous man. Now, the word vengeance there, you see that it says at the end of verse 4, yet vengeance suffereth not to live. Vengeance isn't allowing him to live. That's what they're saying. So many people think that the word vengeance there refers to a Greek goddess that the people of Malta would have absolutely worshipped, named Dike. And this was the Greek goddess who was the personification of justice. And so basically what they're saying is justice, this Greek goddess, she's not going to let Paul live. That's clearly what happened. He survived somehow the sea. He's not going to survive this. The gods have got him. And so they believe that she used this snake to get Paul, since he had escaped the sea where he was supposed to die. And so because of all this, again, he must be a murderer. Now, what happened next would have been a shock to all of them. Paul, it says he shook off the beast into the fire and felt no harm. Well, even that in of itself is a miracle. I mean, if you just got bit by a snake, whether it's venomous or not, you're going to feel some harm. But Paul felt nothing. Not even the bite, not the venom. He felt nothing. It's just a minor inconvenience that he just needs to toss into the fire and keep going. Now, the natives, they're watching this, and they can't believe this. Again, they already thought the gods tried to get him there, and now the gods try to get him here, and somehow he has escaped both. And so you see them. They're waiting for him. They're just watching. They're just watching that hand. They know that hand's about to swell up, and you're about to drop dead any second. We're just going to watch this in real time. But it doesn't happen. And so it says they changed their minds, and now they think that he was a god. Well, clearly, if the gods can't get him, he must be a god. Now, interestingly, this is the second time we've seen in the book of Acts where people thought Paul was a god. If you remember back when Paul and Barnabas were in the city of Lystra, they were teaching, and the people said, the gods are come down because of the things they were saying. And they tried to make sacrifices to Paul and Barnabas. And Paul had to talk them down. We're just men like you. We're not gods. And so we don't know, we're not given what Paul said here, but I can guarantee you he said something similar, right? If he had even the inkling of an idea that these people were starting to think him a god, he would have quelled that very fast. He was not one to receive worship of himself. Now, I just want to make this point. They were right. The people of the island were right to believe that murder was wrong and deserving of punishment. They were wrong to think that Paul was a murderer, but they were right to think that murder was wrong and deserved even capital punishment. And this is another testament to the fact of what the Bible tells us. In Romans chapter 2, it says that Gentiles show the work of the law written in their hearts. What does it say this? Even if they don't know the God of the Bible, even if they've never heard the name Jesus, they still have an inkling of the divine because they have the law written on their hearts. Why do they, people all over, people groups, even these native populations that have never even had people visit them before, they all have consistently throughout history have had certain moral beliefs that are in line with Scripture. Now, obviously not all of them. But all people groups agree that murder is wrong. All people groups agree that if I've married this person, you don't get to have this person. Right? We agree on certain things. And why? Because the Bible tells us that the work of the law is written in their hearts. They have a conscience that is trying to point them back to the very God that created them. And so there was a sense in which they were right, but obviously they were wrong in their interpretation. Yes, murder is wrong. Murder should be judged. It just happens to be that Paul wasn't a murderer. He hadn't murdered anybody. And so their interpretation of the facts were wrong. This was not divine punishment, nor was Paul himself divine. It was, however, divine protection from the only true God, which had promised things like this long before this event took place. Just a couple of texts in Mark chapter 16. It says, "And these signs shall follow them that believe in my name. They shall cast out devils. They shall speak with new tongues. They shall take up serpents. It says, if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover." Another one in Luke chapter 10, Jesus says, "Behold, I give you power to tread on serpents and on scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you." And so you see that similar language in both of them. They shall take up serpents, and it shall not hurt them. I give you the power to tread on serpents, and nothing by any means shall hurt you. Well, then what does Luke tell us here? That Paul was bit by this hand, but he wasn't hurt. Right? So he's clearly pointing us back to these particular texts to show that these were promises given by God, wherein we see fulfillment here in the life of Paul. Now, I don't know if this is the only time somebody got bit by a venomous snake and survived, but we do know that Luke gave us this here clearly to show us that these aren't empty promises. No, these were real promises and real prophecies that really came true. And just to add an addendum onto that, probably at least most of us know that there is a Christian sect, although I highly doubt the Christian aspect of that. But there's a group of people really kind of in the Appalachian Mountain area, but they refer to themselves as Christian snake handlers. I don't know if you've seen these people, and they consider it a point of worship that God said these things, and so we have to handle snakes as Christians. And so during their worship services, all of them are passing these snakes around, and the guy who's preaching is holding snakes. It's kind of a crazy and wild thing. But they handle these venomous snakes, and many of them have died doing so, which should be a point of interest to them. But nevertheless, they do this. Now, here's the difference. Paul wasn't picking up this snake to tempt God with it. Paul wasn't picking up this snake to say, here, you said I could hold a snake. Well, here I am holding this snake. Nothing can happen to me. No, God protected him in a moment where Paul probably didn't even know there was a snake in his hand. And so this was proof that God would protect. He never said, hey, I'm going to protect you from all snakes, so test me on this. Everybody go out and grab all the venomous snakes you can and try to get them to bite you and see if I help you survive. No, we're not to tempt God. We're never told to tempt God. And so this is a very, very different thing that Paul did and what these people over there are trying to do. Okay, so we move on. So Paul is healed from this. They believe he's a God, but what happens next kind of shows them at least Paul's particular beliefs on this. And so look at verse 7. It says, "In the same quarters were possessions of the chief man of the island, whose name was Publius, who received us and lodged us 3 days courteously." And so after this particular incident, Paul was given further opportunity to show the power of the actual true God. And so the order of events is really important here. And so near where they had come up upon the shore and where they were, providing this fire for them, the chief man of the island, the governor of the island, whatever word you want to use, he lived there. And so this man brought them from the boat to stay with him for 3 days. Again, another sign of the benevolence of this particular people. And so in verse 8 it says, "And it came to pass that the father Publius lay sick of a fever and of a bloody flux, to whom Paul entered in and prayed and laid his hands on him and healed him." And so this man's father is laying there sick. The Bible says he has a fever and what King James here calls a bloody flux. This is an interesting phrase, but it comes from the Greek word dysenteria, which is where we get the English word dysentery. Just to kind of give us an idea of what this man was sick with. In fact, there's a known disease that exists there on the island of Malta that we can't know for certain that this is what this man was sick with, but there is a known disease that exists there due to basically the bacteria found in goat's milk that they would consume, and it would give them a sickness and a fever that I read that sometimes would even last for years in the wrong conditions. Now, again, we don't know for certain that that's what this man had, but we do know that that's a medical thing that exists on that particular island. And so Paul had evidently garnered some respect from this man to even have this opportunity. And this is another interesting thing for me about Paul. Paul gained the respect of almost everybody he was ever around, other than the ones who were actively trying to kill him. You had the Jewish people and the religious Jews and some of the Gentiles who weren't so happy with him, but more often than not, even the people who disagreed with Paul had a respect for him, which is important because the Bible tells us that's exactly how it ought to be for Christians. Right? They might not necessarily agree with you, but they should respect you. They should have an idea of the kind of person you are, and that should be a respectable person. And so he invites Paul to come in and to try and help his father. And so what Paul does then would show definitively that their belief that he was a god was wrong in the way that he did it. And so it says that Paul entered in and he prayed and he laid his hands on him and he healed him. He prays audibly for those to hear so that they can know definitively, not only am I not a god, but I actually rely upon God. I need God to help me do this. I can't just do this on my own. And so he does this to help them understand a little bit of their incorrect theology here. Paul's not a god. He needs God. He depends upon God. He walks in faith of God. He himself is not a god. And so in verse 9 it says, when this was done, others also which had diseases on the island came and were healed. Well, again, it's a small island. We talked about that earlier. It's a small island. Word gets out that this man's father was healed. And so everybody just starts thinking, well, hey, if healing's taking place, let's bring everybody. And so they do this, and Paul heals them. And this is interesting. There's a very interesting parallel here to Jesus' public ministry. And so in Luke chapter 4, it says, and he, being Jesus, he arose out of the synagogue and entered into Simon's house, and Simon's wife's mother was taken with a great fever. And they besought him for her, and he stood over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her. And immediately she arose and ministered unto them. Now when the sun was setting, all they that had sick and divers diseases brought them unto him, and he laid his hands on every one of them and healed them. And so listen to the parallels here. Jesus healed the mother-in-law of his host, which led to the healing of others by the laying on of hands. Paul healed the father of his host by the laying on of hands, which led to the healing of others. And so there's a very interesting parallel here between Jesus' ministry and Paul's ministry, and there were many, many parallels that we've tried to point out as we've gone throughout the book of Acts. But as a result here, the people here of Malta, it says that they honored us with many honors, and when we departed, they laded us with such things as were necessary. Now, this is such a fascinating aspect of the story to me, because as I was kind of thinking over Paul's ministries and the things that we have read over the last several chapters of the book of Acts. So we've talked about this earlier on, where Paul met with difficulty everywhere he went, right? Everywhere he went. He has a whole list of things that he endured in 2 Corinthians, and the beatings and the whippings and the imprisonments and all the things. Twice he was stoned, right? All of these things that he lists in 2 Corinthians. And so Paul went to a whole lot of places in his ministry where he was free, as far as it was concerned, with the Roman government. He was a free man and almost always ran into hardship from the local people. And then here he comes to Ireland, not only shipwrecked, but as a prisoner, and finds some of the most welcoming people he had ever come across. And so it's just God using these interesting elements of this particular story to continually encourage, lead, and guide Paul. And so he could have faced the difficulties here that he had faced everywhere else. By the way, I don't think that would have stopped Paul. I think he would have continued to give God the praise. But here, what does God do? He continues to show Paul grace. He continues to encourage Paul. And so God used the island of Malta to be a balm for Paul. I mean, think about this. And not just Paul, I would say probably the others as well. In the midst of what had become a most arduous journey, and then in turn, he used Paul to be a blessing to the people of Malta. And so God here was just showing his power over this disease, his power over the snake, but he was also showing his grace, his loving kindness, his mercy to this people, and he used his man not only to be the means of it, but also to receive it. And so all of this was happening in order to be a balm to Paul, but to everybody involved, including the natives of the island of Malta. And such is the means of God. He can do this, and he consistently does do this. And then we get to verse 11. It says, "And after 3 months, we departed in a ship of Alexandria, which had wintered in the isle, whose sign was Castor and Pollux." I told you earlier that Malta did have a port city. And so they get to the port city, and they find another Alexandrian ship. Interestingly enough, the one that they were in was also an Alexandrian ship previously. But they find another Alexandrian ship that was also going to Rome. And it says at the end of verse 11 there, the sign was Castor and Pollux. Now this is a pair of Greek gods. They're in the Greek mythology, they are twin half brothers. It's a very odd and very difficult to explain story, and it's actually kind of debated a little bit. But Castor and Pollux were these twin half brothers, which is an odd thing. But they were in the Greek pantheon. And in the Greek mythology, one of them was mortal, one of them was divine, but they were known, amongst other things, they were known to be the patrons of sailors, and the Greeks believed that if, under their banner or under their sign, that they would give favorable winds in sailing, that they would give protection to the sailors while sailing. Now, I don't know that Julius, the centurion, I don't know that he went out and was seeking for a ship with that particular sign, given everything that they've gone through. But it also would make sense that this man who, maybe had started to see the goodness of God, maybe even was kind of believing it, but definitely was not a Christian by this point. And so perhaps he was seeking this out because in their particular paganistic beliefs, they thought that this would give him protection. And so, given everything that they've been through, I understand that impulse. He was just looking to the wrong place. And so they find this particular ship. And they load up and they leave from there. And so I'll add a quote from Darrell Bach here. It says, "This journey has an added symbol of protection for the Gentile travelers that has nothing to do with the gods. The Lord will deliver Paul to his destination." And so they again, assuming that that's why they got the ship, they believe they're getting divine protection. They do, just not from the place that they think they're getting it from. Right? And so they're getting divine protection from the only true God while thinking it has something to do with this Castor and Pollux here. Now, they finally make it to Syracuse. Syracuse is on the eastern coast of Sicily. And again, if I had a map, I'd throw it up there. But Sicily is a little island right off the southern edge of Italy. And there's a little strait that goes right between Sicily and the mainland of Italy. And so Syracuse is on the eastern coast of Sicily. And they stay there for 3 days. And then they finally make it to mainland Italy, and they stop at a city called Rhegium for a day, and then with a good wind, they come to Puteoli. And this Puteoli, I don't know how to pronounce this, but it's called Pazuli or something along those lines today. I don't know the right pronunciation for that. But this was another main port for grain in Italy. I don't know if this new ship was also a grain ship. We're not told. But this was another main port for grain. I think we can assume that it was because they stay here for 7 days. And so this ship is probably unloading all of its contents here at Puteoli. And this, for 7 days, Paul's there. And then it says that we found brethren. Okay, and so we found brethren there at the port of Puteoli. I'll quote Phillips here. He says, "Always kindly toward Paul, and now not only deeply indebted to him, but probably in considerable awe of him, the centurion gave Paul permission to seek out the Christian community in town. No sooner did Paul make contact with the Christians in Puteoli than they were eager to extend their fellowship to him and to the other Christians with him. So off Paul went, both to be ministered unto and to minister." And the reason why I point this out is because time and time again we see on this journey, I think the impulse would be to focus on the wind, to focus on the shipwreck, to focus on the hardships, 2 weeks of fasting, all the things that they endured. And what can be missed in that when we do that is the constant grace, is the constant mercy, is the constant goodness of God being given to Paul and these other men to endure this hard journey. And so we don't want to focus on all the negative when God is there pouring out his love and grace. And we don't want to miss the things that God are doing for Paul and all these other men, and in turn for us even still today. And then finally, after many, many chapters, finally from Puteoli they went toward Rome. And so finally Paul is making his way to the city that has been his determination now for years. For years, Paul has been determined to go to Rome. And one thing after another didn't allow him to do it before he was arrested. And then he got arrested, had been in Caesarea for 2 years. Now he's been for weeks on this particular journey. And then finally, they're making their way to Rome. And so they would have taken what's called the Appian Highway, which was a 5-day walk all the way from Puteoli to Rome. Now, along the way, we're told that Christians came from Rome. They heard that Paul was coming. How they know, we're not told, but they come from Rome down south along that particular highway, and they come to travel the rest of the way with Paul. And so they meet him at certain stops along the highway to walk the rest of the way into Rome with him. And so again, I add, what a tremendous grace from God for Paul. And Paul understands this. He says at the end of verse 15, he said that when Paul saw, he thanked God and took courage. Now think about this. It says that not only did he thank God, but he took courage. Now, we don't know if by the fact that he took courage in this, it just simply means he was even more encouraged than he already was, or if Paul at this particular point was, kind of deeply in need of some encouragement from God. We're not told one way or the other. But it doesn't matter one way or the other. He still was encouraged by this, that God would do this grace for him. And so finally it says, and when we came to Rome, the centurion delivered the prisoners to the captain of the guard. And so Julius here, this is what he has to do. This is his position. He hands Paul and the other prisoners over to the captain of the guard. But interestingly enough, we still see a certain degree of leniency for Paul. And so it says at the end of verse 16, but Paul was suffered to dwell by himself with a soldier that kept him. Now, instead of being put in prison, he was allowed to live alone under the watch of a single guard. This is not typically how things were done. Not only was he allowed to live alone and not in the prison house, but under the watch of a single guard. This, again, was not how things were normally done. Now, I know we read it earlier, but down in verse 30, it says, and Paul dwelt 2 whole years in his own hired house. And so when they allowed him to stay alone, basically they told Paul to rent a place to stay. And so that's what he did. Now, exactly where those funds came in was more than likely from the various churches who supported Paul and helped Paul. And so here he was able to rent a place for 2 years. And so again, everywhere he goes, even here in Rome, they don't know this man. They don't know Paul. They may have been briefed a little bit upon the story and all that has gone on and the reason why he's there, but they don't know him. They'd never met him. And yet even still, upon getting to Rome, God is still giving him a certain degree of leniency and grace. Why? Because Paul's mission wasn't over. Paul still had work to do. Paul would still have Christians coming to him and leaving. He could lead and guide churches from where he was through the faithful workers who were coming to him in and out. He could witness to the people who were involved with him, the soldiers. He had a soldier literally chained to him 24 hours a day. Boy, they couldn't get away from the gospel. There was no choice they had but to listen to Paul preach the gospel to them day in and day out. And I know I've quoted this several times during this past few chapters, but when Paul writes to the Philippians, he tells them that they of Caesar's household greet you. Well, how do you think those of Caesar's household became Christians? Because Paul was in Rome. He couldn't go anywhere else. All he could do was just simply preach the gospel. And so if that's all he could do, what do you think he did? He preached the gospel day in and day out to the people who had no choice but to be there with him and to listen to him. And so again, this is the goodness of God. This is God putting his man where he needed his man to be and using means that we might not agree with, we might not even like, but God has all the answers. God has all the details. We don't. And so this is the means that God chose to use to get Paul to the place where the gospel was going to be the most effective. Now, as we close out, this is the last of the we sections in Acts. So as we've talked about, there are several we sections, and by that we mean instead of saying they went and did this or he went and did this, it was we went and did this. We went to these places, meaning Luke was with Paul. Now the we part of this ends, and so verse 16, and when we came to Rome, And so after that, verse 17, and it came to pass that after 3 days, Paul called the chief. Not we, but Paul did. And so you can see the we section ends here. And so Luke was, we know from some of Paul's other writings that Luke was with him for at least part of his time in Rome. We don't know if he was there for the entire time. Paul mentions both Aristarchus, who we saw in the last chapter went with Paul, that he mentions both Aristarchus and Luke, amongst some others who were with him. He mentions them in his letters to Philemon and the letter to the Colossians, and both of those letters were written during this time when he was imprisoned in Rome. And so we know that they were with him at least during part of this time. Now think about this. It didn't have to be this way. It didn't have to be this way. He could have been put in the common prison with everybody else, had a couple of soldiers chained to him 24/7 until he waited to talk to Nero. They could have done things the normal way. But God gave him this grace as to not be alone. And I know, he would have had a soldier, chained to him, but to not have a Christian brother there with him to encourage him, to strengthen him, to give him word on how the church was doing, to let him know how things were going out in the broad world. And so God gave him this grace to not be alone during this particular time, but to have other Christians ministering to him during this desperate time of need. And so time and time again, what I've wanted to make clear was that God was being so good to Paul. We don't want to focus on the hardships. We want to focus on the goodness of God. Now, Paul had written to the Romans years before this, several years before this, that he had a great desire these many years to come unto you. And so many years before this, Paul had written to the Romans and said, for many years I have wanted to go to Rome. We don't know the total of years that this has been, but a long time, Paul had a desire to be in Rome. This journey was certainly unexpected. Paul was still a prisoner, but he was finally in Rome. He was finally in the place where he had so desired to be. Now, he may not have known why this is the way that God chose him to get him there, but he didn't need all of the facts to continue to faithfully serve and proclaim the name of God. And I say that because I would say more often than not, if ever, we will never know all the facts of why we go through all the things that we do. We will never understand every detail of every difficult situation we face, at least not this side of heaven. But that doesn't mean because I don't know, God, I'm just not going to serve anymore. I'm going to throw in the white towel. No, we, like Paul, we continue to faithfully serve and proclaim the name of God. And so many might look over this passage and think, why would God make Paul go through so much? But as I've been trying to say all morning, in doing so, you miss all that God did for Paul. God made a promise to Paul. And since that time, he has provided for him. He has miraculously protected him. He has graciously encouraged him. He has let him have protections that most people in his situation would never have had. And the result of all this was the gospel getting to the highest reaches of the globally dominant empire. There was no place in the world at this time more important than where Paul was at this exact moment. You see, God knew where the gospel needed to go. And Paul willingly said, if this is how I'm going to go, God, get me there, whatever the means may be. And God used shipwreck. He used imprisonment. He used trial. He used difficulty. But God got his man where he needed to be to get the gospel in one of the most important parts of the world at that particular time. And so I'll close with this. There's an old poem. It's debated as to who wrote this, but there's an old poem that ends this way. How he uses, whom he chooses, and with every purpose fuses him, with mighty acts induces him to try his splendor out. God knows what he's about.